Welcome back, everybody. I am so excited today to introduce to you our special guest. Dr. Harris has been a licensed psychologist and health service provider for 12 years, working in mental health for over 20 years. She specializes in coping and adjustment to acute and chronic illness, health and birth-related trauma, and grief and loss. And we are just going to jump right on. And everybody, please welcome Dr. Harris. Hello.
Hello, Meg. How are you?
I am fabulous, and I'm so grateful and honored to be able to spend the next hour or so with you. I really appreciate you.
Absolutely, and the feeling is mutual. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So I always I need to actually stop having this segment because I used to ask people how we know each other because I would find people that I used to work with or people I knew from childhood, and now it's just me reaching out to people and asking them to come on. So that's
Mhm.
how we know each other, is that I reached out to you on Instagram DM, and I appreciate you
Yes,
answering the call.
absolutely. I like to slide in people's DMs myself, and so
Mm-hmm.
whenever someone does it, I feel like I'm obligated to say yes,
Oh,
and just love what you're doing. So thank you again.
no, it's my absolute pleasure. Yes. So, I just wanted to jump in. We talked about a little bit in the bio, but how did you decide to get into psychology?
I have always been fascinated by human behavior, in
Mm-hmm.
large part when I was a kid by looking at my own interesting family, we'll call it. And always had a love and a connection with little children,
Mm-hmm.
and their families. And I think that's what sort of sparked my interest. So I entered undergrad with an accounting degree because
Interesting.
yes, my dad was a certified public accountant. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought, okay, I'm going to follow in his footsteps. After 3 months of that, I thought, this is not for me. And
Mm-hmm.
took a couple psychology classes, really loved them, and just never looked back. And here we are.
Amazing. That's so interesting. Accounting. Yes. I know my
Mhm.
undergrad is in business, so I had to take 2 semesters of accounting, 201 and
Okay.
202, I think. And that was definitely an interesting thing. And then to make the jump over to social work.
Yeah.
Quite a
Yeah.
change there. Yeah.
Well, and
And
here's the interesting thing now, like as a
mhm.
business owner, I'm almost channeling my dad because I
Yeah,
need some good accounting.
it's so true. It's so true. Absolutely. I mean, having my private practice, I've definitely noticed, like, I used to do pen and paper, and then I upgraded to an Excel spreadsheet with
Mhm.
all the different tables and this and that adds
Yep.
this and taxes and quarterly revenue and
Yes. Yeah, it's a fun ride. So business is probably like perfect for you because you know what that feels like as an owner, as private practice.
yes. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. If only I had a little more recent marketing class, I think I could probably do a little better. Maybe need to brush up on that.
Me as well.
Yeah, that's definitely, hey, that's something they don't teach you in school to be a mental health provider, is how to run your business, how to do the dang
No,
thing.
no, they don't. For some reason, we just think if we get the degree, hang the shingle, then the people will come.
Yes.
Uh, and it doesn't work that way. But yeah, marketing would
Yeah.
be awesome. So let me know if you ever are in the, hunt for that and find some good nuggets for me.
I will let you know for sure. And I've seen some, I've gotten some emails, and yeah, so we'll have to we'll definitely keep in touch with you if I find something that really speaks to me.
Okay.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that you were had a real connection with little children. And I know that I kind of reached out to you specifically so that we could kind of talk about grief. And
Mhm.
what was it kind of with the perinatal space, with the health space, all of the work that you've been doing that kind of led you into that grief space?
Mhm. So the easy answer would
Yeah.
be that my mom's death in 2012 was sort of the catalyst
Hmm.
but now that I look back on my career, beginning in the mid 90s, I realized that I've been in the death and dying, grief and loss space since then.
Hmm.
So just to give a little bit of a context, I started my career off in early childhood, and
Hmm.
I was working in homes with children and families with an array of developmental differences. And throughout that process, some of those kids physically died, but even more than that, a lot of the families were dealing with the grief associated with their child and their life not
Yeah.
being the vision that they thought it was.
Hmm.
And it didn't really dawn on me until I went to get my master's degree, worked with children with cancer, and
Hmm.
had some direct exposure to physical death.
Hmm.
Um, and then subsequently, with my pre-doctoral internship and postdoc, I realized that that was such an important niche.
Hmm.
And then my mom died.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things were sort of
Right.
setting the background for it. But my mom's death was what made me absolutely for sure that I
Mm-hmm.
needed to focus in this particular niche and haven't looked back. That was in December 2012.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
how do you deal with kind of that, the vicarious trauma of sitting in those spaces and working with people? How has that been for you?
hmm That is such an excellent question, and I think that as a mental health provider,
Mm-hmm.
we're natural nurturers, and it's beautiful to sit alongside someone and watch them grow and watch the wheels turning and the connections being made. What
Mm-hmm.
I realized when my mom died was that I needed to really set some very firm boundaries from
Mm-hmm.
work and home, and that's not to say that my personal self didn't bleed in because we're always walking in our full humanity.
Of course.
At the same time, I knew the value of taking breaks, of taking vacations, of setting up my schedule in a way where I wasn't overloaded. And now that I've been in private practice 100% for 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
it has been just really beautiful to have flexibility in my schedule and to be able to take that midday walk that I had today and
Mm-hmm.
other ways to stop so that I'm not taking on my clients' concerns wholeheartedly
Right.
all throughout the day.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
And that's really a lovely way of describing that. And I think a lot of us, even if you're not a mental health professional, it's very helpful to keep that sort of thing in mind about
Mhm.
being intentional and recognizing, like, what does your load look like? Where are you pouring out yourself to other people? How
Mhm.
can you be empathetic, not sympathetic?
Mhm.
Um, and knowing when it's okay to say, I've had enough for
Yeah.
today, this week, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. And I think it's important for professionals to sort of always be in that space of assessing your motivations. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
obviously, in a forward-facing career, you want to help and give, and there is a spark that you get inside as a professional when you see the person in the room making progress. It feels
Mm-hmm.
good to know that
Mm-hmm.
you help plant that seed and water it. At the same time, to really focus on why am I here, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And once you determine the answer to that question, it really helps you sort of take a step back, perhaps, or engage even more if you need to, while at the
Mm-hmm.
same time protecting your own self care space.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you sharing that with me for sure. And so I was kind of wanting to jump in talking about, because I think, with social media, there are plenty of things that go wrong with social media, but I think we are doing a decent job of putting a dent in decreasing the mental health stigma and
Mhm,
seeking help and speaking about it, not suffering in silence and going it alone. I think we've got kind of well, I know we've got a long way to go in a lot of areas and mental health globally, but I've seen some progress in grief with not getting over it, air quotes, but finding a way of walking through life with it. Of course,
mhm.
that is not true for everybody. And so I was just kind of curious, what are some things, how do you help people to take that viewpoint of grief in a healthy way? It's a journey, not a destination, not something to get over. What does that look like for you? Of course, knowing that every person is incredibly individual.
Absolutely. Well, here's the quote unquote good thing. One good thing that came out of COVID-19 is that
Hmm.
we as a world had a chance to walk through an experience that we'd never been in before.
Hmm.
And on some level, every single person experienced a loss, whether it was the
Hmm.
physical death of someone or the loss of a vision for your individual self, the
Hmm.
inability to do certain things. And I think that has helped society as a whole
Hmm.
recognize the fact that this really is a journey, that there's not a designated endpoint with regard to how we cope with loss. So that's one thing. But one of the ways that I like to really sit with folks and talk about is this idea of the biomedical model. So,
Hmm.
psychology, even though it's distinct in some ways from the medical health profession, there's overlap. And
Hmm.
so, to that degree, I think that we have tended to look at mental health very much like a medical issue. So,
Hmm.
for example, you go to your physician. There is, a wound. The physician tends to it, there's bandages put on it, and at some point you walk away and you look down and there's no scarring, there's no visibility to what happened, and it really is over. The body has healed itself from the outside in.
Mhm.
And because of this biomedical model, I think a lot of times in mental health, including grief, we look at it like that,
Right.
where someone experiences a loss, they go in and have it looked at, or they shine a light on it themselves.
Mhm.
They put a bandage on that. Maybe it's crying for in the acute moments after the experience, and they think it's over.
Mhm.
So I love to do a lot of education around that and really get people thinking about the fact that while some of these mental health issues are outgrowths of the biomedical model, it really is different. And
Mhm.
until we change our mindset with regard to that, we'll continue to perpetuate
Mm.
misnomers with regard to grief, which is that it's something that you get over.
Right.
Or a year after someone's died, why can't we just move on? Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's really the way that I like to think about it.
Yes, when you just said that, I just had so many, like the fluttering of people saying, it's been a year, it's been a decade, it's been
Mhm.
30 years.
Yep.
Why am I crying talking to you
Mhm.
about this? And it's like,
Mhm.
there is nothing wrong with crying. And of course,
That's right.
what are the expressions and the cliches of like, grief is the price of love and beautiful ways of looking at it in that way. But yeah, and I think of course, we all try to find ways to numb and dampen our emotions, certainly.
Yeah.
And grief is in no exception to that, and one that we just want to be able to walk away from, or, you know, put the cast on the leg, let it set,
Yep.
take off the cast and
Take
leave it
off.
behind.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think love doesn't have an expiration date. And if
Mm-hmm.
you go back to some of these quotes, grief is love, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in a different form. And I think that if we think about it that way, we can also realize that grief does not have an expiration date.
Mm-hmm.
So I think conversations like this are really powerful in helping to reset the narrative about grief and loss. And
Mm-hmm.
then looking at what we've gone through, again, back to COVID, we can look to ourselves and say, well, gosh, COVID started. Technically, the World Health Organization announced this in March 2020, but we're still in the midst of moving through this process, and it's an
Mm-hmm.
ever changing and shifting experience. So that has been one thing that's helped all of us in this
Mm-hmm.
space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I deal with a lot of, so I obviously we've talked before today that I specialize in perinatal mental health, and that's
Mhm.
something that has been something that's a very difficult thing to deal with, pregnancy loss, the stress of trying to conceive and infertility, the death of a dream there, where it turns out that that's just not going to be an option.
Mhm.
Um, all of the different ways that it looks like, in addition to the grief that we've described now,
Mhm.
um, and that is something again where people feel, the other thing that concerns me about it is kind of like I call it the trauma Olympics. That's not my expression, but like other people have said too. And it's like, well,
Mhm.
I was only pregnant this long, so I'm not allowed to be as upset as this person, or I've only had whatever. And it's like,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
no.
Yeah, no, I've certainly heard that in the perinatal space,
Mm-hmm.
when a mom carries a baby nearly to term or at term, and then there's a stillborn birth,
Mm-hmm.
and then a mom who's experienced a miscarriage, sort of comparing the
Mm-hmm.
depth of that and
Mm-hmm.
almost deciding that their grief is not worth it
Uh-huh.
or not significant enough to be named.
Uh-huh.
You really got to be careful with regard to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think those invisible losses, like
Mm-hmm.
miscarriage,
Mm-hmm.
like infertility, it sort of falls under that umbrella of ambiguous loss. And
Mm-hmm.
societally, we do tend to overlook those because it's not a tangible, visible loss that we can wrap our minds around, but it definitely doesn't discount the experience for the person who is navigating it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate you talking about that too, that ambiguous loss and how society does tend to overlook that. And that's what it's a difficult thing to, it's like people feel like they need permission to grieve in those situations, where in the other ones where, well, I guess it's all kind of that space of like, I shouldn't be allowed to still be upset because it's been 30 years since this person has lost, or whatever it might be, the loss of.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
I think
huh,
what came to mind was miscarriages. I think that in that specific space, what we don't know for the person who's walking through that is all of the losses, not necessarily miscarriages, but all of the loss of vision, all of the loss of
yes.
uh, dreams along the way, and
Mm-hmm.
then a potential miscarriage. And
Mm-hmm.
so, again, I think we've got to have conversations like this to really
Mm-hmm.
shine a light on the fact that you never really know another person's experience. And I'm not even going to say what people might think I'm going to say, which is until you've walked in their shoes,
Right.
I'm never going to walk in anyone's shoes.
That's right.
Yes. I
That's it.
love Brene Brown sort of talked about this, which I love how she reframed it. But we won't walk in someone's shoes. What we have to do is listen to their lived experience,
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not we've walked in those shoes or can imagine walking in those shoes, we have to believe the lived experience of the other person. And so,
That that is it.
yeah, yeah. So, to that end, I think we've got to do a lot more listening to the people who are experiencing loss and simply believe them without judging or trying to shift them into another space. Just believe the lived experience. And if we can do that, then
Mm-hmm.
we can definitely extend much more compassion along the way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that so much because I talk about that all the time too. I will never understand. I will never understand what anybody's going through. I understand the words you're telling me. I
Mhm,
validate what you're sharing with me. I
mhm.
will never be able to say I know. I that is one of the things that kind of sends chills up my spine when someone says, I know how you feel. It's like,
Yeah.
oh,
No, you don't.
no, you don't.
Yeah,
Not only do you
yeah,
not, but I don't need you to. I just need you to say, like, let me sit with you. Let me hold this space with you.
that's
Let
right.
me, let you know that I do, not that you need me to validate, but I am validating what you're saying.
Mhm,
And you just never know. And yeah, I think that kind of does continue to be the ongoing thing that I've experienced, especially in the perinatal space, is recognizing that. And two, to your point, we talk about, like, I've had someone on who talked a lot about vicarious trauma, and she talks about like naming it, claiming it, reframing it. Um,
mm,
and I think that's something too. I love how you described kind of the passing of your mother was what tipped the scale, but then you had a reflection of being able to say, like, and this, and this, and this, and this. And that's the
mhm.
same thing with a pregnancy crisis or
That's
fertility loss. All of those things that add up. It's not just that specific moment that
that's
we're
right.
grieving, and we need to be able to allow ourselves to really conceptualize and wrap ourselves around, wrap it around and say, like, I need to be able to process all of these things and be able to get to that space where it all makes sense for me.
Yeah, there's a powerful tool that I love to do with clients, and I've done this with myself, is with the right timing and in the right, rapport space to be
Mm-hmm.
able to do a bit of a chronology
Mm.
and really think about, this idea of as we reflect over our lifespan, where have been those junctures where we had an expectation and that expectation wasn't met,
Yes.
because I think
Mhm.
that's what creates crisis for all of us, is this vision and then reality. And in between, we have in acceptance and commitment theory, therapy, this idea of the reality gap, and really shining a light on that. And when we do, we realize that there have been so many cumulative letdowns, cumulative pivots, if you will, cumulative redirections and disappointments and losses.
Mhm.
Now that we're sitting in the room, yes, it makes so much sense that you are experiencing this, not on a level that doesn't make sense to what's going on, but from a cumulative perspective. And I
Yeah.
found that to be really powerful,
Mhm.
to witness for people who are walking through loss.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yes. And I know
Yeah.
I would love for you to tell us a little bit about, I've downloaded your grief anatomy toolkit, and was just kind of wondering if you could kind of give everybody as high or in-depth level. I mean, I'll sit here and talk to you all day, of kind of a view of what that's about, and how the idea came to you, the process of putting it together, how you've seen that be helpful, because it's such a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Yeah, thank you. So the Grief Anatomy Toolkit is it's a mini course with really what I call encouraging words along the way to keep you wedded to some of the tools and practices in the kit.
Hmm.
And this was sort of born out of things that I wish I had had when my mom died. So obviously, we're in the world of Google. And you can certainly Google, what is grief and what are the symptoms and what can I do to help myself. I really wanted a toolkit, just sort of a tangible one packet sort of material for
Hmm.
someone to have to really think about those three things. What can grief look like? In the toolkit, I share my story. So again, that people realize that I'm not coming only from a professional perspective, but
Right.
I'm also navigating that journey. And
Hmm.
then secondly, what are five practical tools that you can think about? So grief is overwhelming and it affects our body, our mind, our spirit, and so much more. And so this was really designed to think about five practical tools that a person might be able to use to navigate it. And
Hmm.
as part of that are some tangible and experiential exercises and practices that I have found valuable in clinical practice, that I've utilized myself, and that are evidence based to support the journey of a grieving heart. So
Hmm.
it's sort of a one snapshot opportunity for a person to use the toolkit, interact with it. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in the toolkit is that it's not a book, it's an ebook, but it's not a book in the sense that you read through it once and it's linear and then you're done.
Right. Right.
No, this is a toolkit that is not presented in a linear fashion, like do this first and then that's going to
Right.
help you get to that. No, this is, you could literally pick it up in the middle and have an idea of a tool and practice that could be beneficial. You might flip to the beginning and realize the benefit of that tool. So it's to be used in a waxing and waning in a flexible fashion
Hmm.
throughout the journey. And I hope that it's one that people go back to and reference as they need it.
Yes. Well, and because truly processing through grief is not a linear situation anyway.
No,
And
can we talk about that, Meg? You
please,
know,
let's
this
please.
is yes. No, I call it. I have this list of grief peeves,
Hmm.
and this is one of mine. In that, I think societally we tend to think of grief as one, two, three, four, five, A, B,
Hmm.
C, D, E.
Yes.
It absolutely is not linear. I'm joking. I jokingly ask people, "Well, wouldn't it be nice if it were
I
that
wouldn't
we
it
started
hey,
here and we end there and then it's over, right?"
here's my checklist. Let me get through them all. I'm
Gosh.
happy as a clam. Life's amazing.
Yes, life went back to quote unquote normal, and here I am. No, so I think
Yeah.
that for those folks who may be listening who are familiar with the stages of grief
Hmm.
framework,
Hmm.
it was born out of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's framework. She is a Swiss psychiatrist, and what she observed in her work with dying individuals was that they begin in this place of complete disbelief and shock,
Hmm.
and as they reached the dying end point, right, they got to this place of what she framed as acceptance. Well, again, this was sort of designed for individuals dying.
Hmm.
Now, when she put the framework out, the grief community, the larger society, sort of adopted it and
Yes.
applied it to survivors of loss. And so that's what it sort of became known as the five stages of grief. And unfortunately, even in 2022, it's sometimes presented in a linear fashion, like you start at disbelief, go to
Hmm.
bargaining, you get angry, you do this, you put a little salt in there and a little pepper in there, and you end up at acceptance.
Yes. Yes. I love.
But that's not true, right? This is not
Yes.
this is not a grief soup, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so what I do appreciate about the five stages of grief model, however, is that it does offer you potential emotional responses in the face of loss.
Yes.
But it certainly is not you start here and end there. So that's what I appreciate about it.
Yes, absolutely. It's funny you were mentioning that, and I'm thinking there are even TV shows, sitcoms. I feel like there's an episode of Scrubs where they actually go through, and of course, that is not 2022. Fair enough,
No, I love
but
that
we're still
show
doing
though.
it now. But I
Yes.
think there's an episode of Scrubs where like everyone's favorite patient is dying, and they're showing all the doctors. They're like showing a montage of all the doctors literally like going through. all the different stages. And again, this is 15 something years ago, but I just remember that. And there are other examples of that where people have kind
Yeah.
of co-opted it of like, no, it was for the person who is about to die, not
Right.
for our, not for a roadmap of how we're going to deal with somebody dying. And I
That's right.
do think it does become dangerous for people who feel like they're, air quotes, doing it wrong.
Wrong. Yes. Oh my gosh. I, over the years, have sat with so many clients who, because they were not in a place of quote acceptance, they were shaming themselves.
Yes.
And when you combine that linear shame on top of the time frame, like it's been 10 years and I still haven't accepted, it's like, wow, we've got to dispel those myths and really talk
Yes.
about the realities of the grief process. But
Mhm.
truly, it's a grief peeve and that it still shows up in 2022.
It
So I'm
does,
glad I'm
absolutely.
glad that we focused on that.
I was gonna say, I'm really glad we took the time to kind of walk through that because I think again, I think tools can be so helpful, right? And we say this about everything. We say this about self-care. We say it goes on to everything. Like take what works for you and leave what you don't feel like is working for you. And if
Absolutely.
you are magically stepping through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's steps, then keep stepping, my friend. Keep
That's
on.
right. That's right.
For the other 98.5% of us, please don't beat yourself up about it. And I think, have you, this is a silly, not a question. The grief is a ball in the box metaphor that
Yes.
people talk about. I
Yes.
think that's a really lovely way of visualizing. People expect, a box and the ball, and eventually to be able to just take the ball out of the box
Hmm.
versus the ball getting smaller and still going to hit that grief button, but it's going
Hmm.
to hit it less frequently as time
Yeah.
goes by and whatever grief work you're doing. But we still want to take the ball out of the box, and the
We
box does
still, I
not do so.
know, that's right. We still want to sort of delete this experience, but the reality is that it's always there and we just learn to grow.
Mhm.
Uh, some people will frame this as growing around it. I tend to visually think of it as growing alongside it.
Yeah.
Grief
Okay.
is sort of a companion that you are taking with you everywhere you go
Mhm.
across time and situations. So it's not that you're getting so big and enveloping it. And I'll explain why I sort of think of it that way.
Mhm.
One is that I'm really focused within myself and with my clients on not consuming a grief identity, and the growing around for me
Mhm.
feels a little bit more like you're sort of soaking in the grief and you're sort of enveloping it, as
Mhm.
opposed to this idea of it walking alongside you. That yes, it's a part of your experience, but it's not necessarily something that is part of your identity. And we've got to
Mhm.
make sure that we recognize other parts of who we are, so
Mhm.
that those areas can actually flourish, and
Yes.
so that grief is not all consuming.
That's a really great way of conceptualizing it too. Like it is a part of who you are, but it is not overtaking.
Hmm.
Yes,
Right, and that's not to say, I wanna be careful, people listening are in different points in their experience with grief,
absolutely. Hmm.
and if someone you love has just died, absolutely, grief is all-consuming,
Yes.
so this is not a judgment call at all. I
Yes.
think as we, sort of experience time, and it's not just time that "heals," quote, unquote, but it's what we do with the time,
Hmm.
that we learn to walk alongside it, and we're
Mm-hmm.
able to carry it with us, but we're carrying it differently than we were, perhaps in the beginning.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Thank you for clarifying because for sure, if you have stumbled across this because you were Googling podcasts on grief and you feel that that's where you are, then please be there. Of course. We're
Mhm,
just saying
mhm,
moving forward, yes, absolutely. And
mhm,
everyone's journey being very different and individualized. And I think that is really kind of what we're trying to say here as well is that there is no one size fits all. I say this too to new clients. If I could give you a checklist of things to do for whatever symptom that you're coming to me for, or whatever potential diagnosis, etc., I'd love to put myself out of business. I'd love to
right,
give you that checklist. I'd
yep,
love for you to go off for a week, maybe, come off, check in for a week. Okay, let's try a couple new things. Go off and do this part of the checklist. Hey, cured,
mhm,
fixed,
mhm.
magic. That it just is not so. There are prescriptive things going back to the biomedical model. Like there are prescriptive things. You have this rash, use this topical ointment for this many days, come back, it's gone. If
Mhm,
only there was
yeah,
a magic
Yeah.
pill.
Right. One thing I will say, so there's absolutely no prescription for grief. I will say, however, there are some fundamental things that are absolutely critical for
Yes.
every single grieving heart.
Mhm.
Number one, rest.
Mm.
Focusing on the physical manifestations of grief and making sure that you're regulating your body is absolutely critical. Partly because, in the face of loss, obviously it feels like there's a rug that's been pulled out, which is dysregulating to the nervous system. And so,
Mhm.
rest provides that soft place to land, that foundation from which we can then build
Mm.
day to day and have more clarity with regard to how we process and move
Mhm.
through grief. Secondly, is eating. That's something that everybody has got to do, and in the face of
Mhm.
grief, sometimes we forget that because
Mm.
our body is, sort of embracing this threat, and our body's focused on other things, so we sort of, demobilize the digestive system and don't eat, or we don't have hunger pains.
Sure.
But making
Sure.
sure that we're focusing on healthy physical and, eating routines is really helpful. And then water, hydration, right? Not to say that everyone's crying their tears out, but tears are certainly part of it.
Sure.
But just given all the energy that goes into grieving,
Mhm.
we have to be nourishing. We have to be filling our body up with nutrients and water and so forth. So those are the three things that I think are universal. Beyond that, we've got to
Yes.
look at our toolkits and play around a little bit to see what fits.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, hydration is key.
Mhm.
Outside, yes, absolutely, and I think, yeah, I do,
It's
and
something
that's
we
what's
forget about.
interesting. I'm sorry.
No, it's something we forget about,
Yes.
when we think
Yeah.
about emotional health symptoms is our body. We've gotta
Yes.
keep it functioning so that we can actually move through.
Well, and something that I think about in my own experiences with grief is kind of that moment right after, and, putting things together and funerals and, different celebrations, whatever it is, and we're all so busy
Mhm.
and we're distracting ourselves. And
Mhm.
so that
Yep.
rest piece certainly doesn't come. Now, sometimes people are trying to shove food down your throat if there are, some sort of gatherings and stuff. But yeah, and so I think it comes back to being really intentional about recognizing, like, I need to take care of myself right now. And that's okay. I don't need to
Right.
be everything for everybody. I cannot be everything for everybody right now.
Correct.
And in just taking the time, those three things specifically, in
Mhm.
in piecing that together, when
Yeah.
something is going like that.
Yeah, and for the people who may be listening who are supporting someone who's grieving,
Mhm,
what a great
mhm.
offering to them, just to have a gentle reminder of, rest. And that doesn't always mean sleeping. That may be literally being still,
Uh-huh.
not busying ourselves, as you sort of alluded to. Now,
Yes,
obviously, we've got to tend to some logistical things when someone physically dies.
of course.
At the same time, when that's sort of settled, how can we be intentional? I love putting things in calendars, writing it
Mhm,
down, sticky notes, having an accountability person to remind us that, hey, have you eaten today? I haven't seen you drink any water. Like, are you
mhm,
hydrating yourself? That's a really wonderful gift to offer someone.
mhm. Oh, wow, absolutely. Because that's, I think, one of the big things too, is that you have people who are experiencing the grief, and then they're feeling like they have to help people help them grieve, because we as a society don't have a toolkit very well for that. Being the
Hmm.
person who's helping, we wanna fix, we
Yes.
want to say something, which what can you say? And then a lot of times we say the wrong things.
Hmm. Sure do.
Perhaps counterproductive things. And that, and going back, sorry, of course, my brain often goes to the perinatal, but in those losses
Hmm.
where, you're coming home from the hospital without a baby, or whatever that might be, and not being able to take care of yourselves, or to feel a way that grieves, intentionally. And that's another thing too, of people, of partners, of parents, of people who have pregnancy losses, or pregnancy crises. And what are some things to do? I'm gonna bring you water. I've bought
Yes.
you a water bottle, or I'm gonna
Yes.
send you a text message and ask about, like, I'm gonna send you a meal. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that we, sort of forget that in the space of loss, one of the best things you can do, it's funny, this morning, someone sent me a message on Instagram, and they were asking the question, what's the best gift to give
Mm.
someone who's experienced a loss? Well, of course, yeah, I argue that there's no best gift,
Sure,
right? But
sure.
one powerful tool that you can offer is your presence,
Mhm.
just being there. And being there not just in the acute sort of time frame of loss, but months down the line, when the phones have stopped ringing, when the meals have stopped coming in,
That's right.
when the phone calls have slowed down, being there and remembering that this event actually happened. Because
Mhm.
one of the things as a grieving heart, I can imagine for a grieving mother and father, is that their child is not here. And if their name is never mentioned or that experience is never mentioned, it's like they never lived.
Yeah.
But they did.
Mhm.
They did, whether they lived in the womb only or whether they were birthed and
Right,
lived outside of the womb,
right.
that experience was real. And
Mhm.
so being present to that and sitting in the discomfort of that can be really powerful so that parents don't feel that they've got to navigate this whole experience in silence, where we know
Yes.
suffering resides in silence.
Yes. Yes, yes. Oh my goodness. Suffering resides in silence, absolutely. And I think that is the thing where we go back to talking about like some people saying some counterproductive things or when and just sitting there and holding that space for somebody
Mhm. Mhm.
and l- uh, not that you have to give somebody permission to take up space, but I feel like we do feel the need to ask for permission to take up space sometimes, especially in a grieving situation, especially when it's air quotes. I keep saying air quotes for the people who are not on the podcast because I really want to make sure that people know that I'm not suggesting this, but it's been long enough. So
Mhm.
I need to get over it
Mhm.
and having somebody who can be there and just say, I'm coming to sit with you and
Yeah.
holding this space.
I was talking to one of my mentors the other day, and we were talking about the phrasing holding space. And
Mm-hmm.
so he was like, Mekel, I want you to try something for me, right? And so he was like, I want you to visualize space.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, we're listening. So my hands are outstretched and it's like, okay, this is really big, right? And then he's like, I just want you to hold it. And so I'm sitting here with my eyes closed and I'm just imagining, holding this.
Mm-hmm.
And so he allowed that for about a minute or so. And then we stopped and he's like, well, what came to mind? How did that feel? What was that like for you? And I was like, first of all, it's enormous.
Mm.
It's enormous. And it feels impossible
Mm-hmm.
because the space is so big that you
Mm-hmm.
can't fill it all. The other thing is you can't materialize it, right? It's not like you're holding a physical object,
Sure.
right?
Here
You're
I
just
am
kind
bringing you
of,
space.
here I am bringing you space that's invisible. But it was a really great reminder of the fact that these truths that yes, this space that the grieving person's in is enormous. It is.
Mm-hmm.
And you are not responsible as the supporter to
Mm-hmm.
hold it all, right?
Yes.
Let's
Oh
all
yeah.
take a breath and remember you're not there to hold it all.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important that you sit in
Mm-hmm.
the discomfort of holding that
Mm-hmm.
space. Even
Mm-hmm.
if your arms are burning, even if it feels awkward, and even if you can't concretize it. And I just loved that because I thought,
Mm.
this is really powerful for the supporter, right? To
Yes.
really talk about the value of their presence
Mm-hmm.
and what holding space actually can mean to the person on the receiving end.
Mm-hmm. That is powerful,
Yeah,
really. And I think
yeah,
it goes back to making sure that we recognize that we don't have to be because we cannot be everything for everybody.
that's right.
We can
That's
show
right.
up in the ways that we can. We
Mhm.
can make sure we don't throw out random cliches and try to make it worse on accident, but otherwise, sitting with that discomfort with somebody, there is really nothing that you can say to fix
No,
it. That's one
no,
of my least favorite words as a social worker is fix. I can't fix your child. I can't fix you. I can't fix a problem. I can help you to do
mhm.
many different things, but fixing is not one of
That's
them.
right.
And so
Yeah.
sitting with that discomfort, absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest tools that we can offer is our physical presence and also knowing the person who's grieving. So I did an entire, not to do a shameless plug, but I will say really
I was
quickly.
going to ask you to do all your plugs anyway, so please go ahead. They're going to be in the show notes.
Over on Instagram, if you click the link in my bio, I
Mhm.
have a free little 30-minute webinar, and it's called How to Show Up for Someone Who's Grieving. And one of the things that I talk about in that webinar is knowing who you are relative to the person grieving. So
Mhm.
I use this lame example of when my dad died in March 2020. I'm
Mhm.
walking my dog in my neighborhood, and of course you see familiar faces in the neighborhood, but you don't really know the neighbor on an intimate level, and they may not be someone who I'm going to invite in my house, but right,
Mhm.
but I see them.
Sure.
I had this really nice yet pesky neighbor who was intent on like coming in my house and making dinner, and I thought, he doesn't really know himself in my sphere, right?
Right.
And so I think there's this push to do one of two things as a supporter, which is either totally avoid the situation
Yes.
or go all in and
Mhm.
almost to the point of being intrusive.
Yes, that was the word that
So
was circling in my brain.
yes. So, just to really take a step back and think about asking yourself, who am I relative to this person? And wherever you are on that in that sphere is important. You still have a role to play. There's something to be done. But I
Mhm.
think if you can assess where you are, it's going to help drive, hey, A, how you can show up, but B, also how you might not show up, and that's okay. So
Yes.
definitely, click on that, and hopefully that benefits some people who are listening.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the more that we can speak about it with all of these things, the more that we're talking about it, the more ideas we have, the more people can conceptualize how that might not necessarily have to follow the Kubler-Ross of it all, or whatever
Hmm.
else they may have considered how grief should, there's another one of my favorite therapist words, look like. And it's just great that such things are available to them, especially. So obviously, like I said, that was going to be my last question, was where can everybody find you? So that's of course going to be in the show notes.
Yeah.
And then of course easily clickable on your Instagram as well, because access to those things, taking the time to educate yourself, whether you're the person who's experiencing the grief or the person you're trying to support somebody who is,
Hmm.
saying like, I'm going to take some time and figure out what I need to do and what my next steps can be. And I don't have to have all the answers right now. Just what's the next thing that I can do?
Yeah, and I think that's a great tool for both the grieving person
Mm-hmm.
and the supporter, is
Mm-hmm.
really focusing on, I'll start with the supporter. What's the next best thing I can do?
Mm-hmm.
And to really sort of sit with that for a minute before you burst through the gates and to really assess. And for
Mm-hmm.
the grieving heart, what's the next best thing? Honestly, that's all that's quote unquote expected of you along the journey, is to focus on the next best thing. And that may be the next second, that may be the next minute of your day,
Mm-hmm.
to not think 5 years down the line, next week, just getting up, getting out of bed, putting that foot on the floor,
Mm-hmm.
taking a shower, starting that routine. That's the next best thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as those steps accumulate, you will be able to move your feet. You're not going to move on, you're not going to get over, but you will
Mm-hmm.
be able to move through a very
Mm-hmm.
difficult a very difficult and sensitive process.
Mm-hmm.
Those
I
steps are critical.
I was to say, I'm glad that you brought that up. Actually, I've had people in various reasons why they come and sit in my metaphorical chair on virtual therapy,
Mhm.
and I've said that to people before, and they kind of laugh. I'm like, "What is your plan for the day?" I don't really have a plan. It's like, okay, what if you just changed from those pajamas to some new pajamas, just some pajamas that you didn't sleep in. Everything else
Mhm.
feels insurmountable in the day. I'm not asking you to put on a prom dress.
Right.
Right? And it's just those
Yes.
little things, and you mentioned taking a shower, which can feel so
Mhm.
overwhelming.
Mhm.
But then, okay, then what's the next thing that we can do? What is that small thing we're gonna make some sort of efforts? We
Mhm.
talk a lot about action before motivation. You're not gonna magically wake up one day and be like, I'm gonna go for a 5 mile run, and I'm gonna whatever else that
Right.
might be.
Yeah.
It can be sometimes putting those feet on the floor
Mhm.
and taking those small steps. Absolutely.
It reminds me of, something my mom used to say, and both of my parents were in the military, by the way, so,
Mm, mm,
physical fitness was a thing in my
mm,
household, but my mom used to always say, that she had never seen a soldier not be able to walk and cry at the same time. Sometimes, and she referred to like basic training and things that she'd gone through, that people were shedding tears while doing the drills.
Mm,
And it's a really beautiful thing to think about, in that
mm,
sometimes we think that if we start taking steps, we're going to forget about our loved one. We're going to forget about that loss, right?
mhm,
We're going to feel like we're betraying the experience or the person, him or herself. The truth
mhm.
is, I've never seen a soldier who can't walk and cry at the same time. So
Wow.
know that your walking does not abandon your feelings. It doesn't abandon the experience that you've had. You can do both. And that really is the grief space, which is both and,
Both
not
in.
either.
Wow. I mean, I have chills. I've never thought about that before. Thank you for sharing that. That is a really good way of viewing that. Absolutely. And you are right. I think that is something that holds up with people, of like, if I'm enjoying my kid's soccer game, then I'm not properly grieving this person. Or if I'm going, and that's the thing too. Sorry, I've mentioned Scrubs twice now, but I do listen to that Scrubs rewatch podcast because I really love the show. And that's what Zach Braff has said a couple of times. Like, what do people do after a funeral? They go to lunch. Like,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
life
Mm-hmm.
continues to, and not everyone eats, which is number 2 on the list of things that you do need to do. So please go to lunch. But right, it's like
Yeah.
life does continue to go on, and we
Mm-hmm.
have to try to find a way of making space and making sense of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, how can I possibly be doing these things while, but
Wow.
I have to tell you, that is gonna sit with me for a long time. About, I've never seen a soldier who can't cry and walk at the same time.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
powerful.
We'll just thank Patricia Ann Harris for that,
Mm,
because
mm.
of course, she was probably saying that when we were kids to get us to
Mhm.
do stuff. Like, come on, get up
Sure.
and make it happen. I don't care if you're crying.
Do it. Cry while you're doing it. Go ahead. You can
Cry
cry.
while you're
Cry.
doing it,
Just
but
do
you're
it.
still going to clean up that room. Yes. But yeah, it's a really beautiful thing to think about in the grief space. Like, you can
Mm,
keep going and
yeah.
moving and expanding
Hmm.
and weeping. They
Yes.
can happen at the same exist. Yes, it's possible. So to really adopt that both and framework can be a really powerful way
Yes.
to keep ourselves thinking about the present and
Hmm.
looking into the future. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I just can't thank you enough. It's what you do is so important. This discussion is so important. I'm so grateful that I've gotten to sit with you and have this conversation. Our listeners now can take this with them, and hopefully take some points with them along the
Yeah.
way. I told you I was going to do this. Where can everybody find you? Because I want, and again, it will be in the show notes. I want them to be able to access the things that we're talking about.
Absolutely. So my favorite place to hang out these days is Instagram. My Instagram handle is Dr. Mekel. That's DrMekel. Not to sound repetitive, but on Twitter, /Dr. Mekel, and then on
Huh?
Facebook, facebook.com/Dr. Mekel.
Great.
And there you'll see lots of grief information, education, tools to help empower you as you navigate this new life after loss. And
Mhm.
then hopefully a little bit of inspiration. I try to sprinkle that in throughout the week so that
Mhm.
you know you're not alone on the journey, and that
Mhm.
you too can take those steps, even with tears streaming down your face.
Mm, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Everyone, take that with you today. Be curious, not judgmental, and make it a good one.